Welcome to Agile Coaches Corner by AgileThought, the podcast for practitioners and leaders seeking advice to refine the way they work and pave the path to better outcomes. Now, here's your host, coach, and Agile expert, Dan Neumann.
Welcome to this episode of Agile Coaches Corner. I'm your host, Dan Neumann, and I'm joined today by Eric Landis, one of my colleagues.
Hello.
And thanks for joining, Eric. We got to get the official stuff out of the way. So our goal here is to bring folks Agile topics in an approachable manner. And of course, the opinions here are going to be yours and mine and not necessarily AgileThought's or any other person's or any other company. So just our opinions if people don't like them.
Sounds good.
If somebody has a topic they want us to discuss, they can email it to podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it to us with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast. And today we're going to be talking about Kanban metrics and the Scrum framework and using the two together. And the best place to start is, but I didn't think we could use Kanban with Scrum. I thought it was an either or choice.
That's a typical response for sure, Dan. And really it's a little different than I had thought even up to maybe a year ago. I really have been, as you know, I'm a professional Scrum trainer and have done Scrum classes for developers and just kind of for Scrum Masters and those kinds of things. And about a year ago, Scrum.org, the organization I train, that has certified me as a trainer, came out with the professional Scrum Kanban for Kanban. So it's really, Scrum teams who want to use Kanban. This is the guide for them. So what we're talking about is not, let's say, like a DevOps team that's doing strictly Kanban and they're working with Scrum feature teams. What we're talking about is actually Scrum feature teams using Kanban to help get flow within that Scrum team. And to me, this is kind of a new thing, and I like the way it's presented with this professional Scrum and Kanban guide that they have. And there's a lot of metrics that I think will help out Scrum teams with some issues that we've seen. But this isn't to say you can't just do Kanban on its own with not within the Scrum framework. What I'm talking about is using Kanban within that Scrum framework.
Yeah, I feel a little dirty because I want to go back at, like, I know that you can use them together, and I wanted to not sound silly at the start there. So you've got the Scrum framework with the roles, the events, and the artifacts of the Scrum framework defined in the Scrum guide, and then the Kanban principles. So making your workflow visible and limiting work in process and having explicit policies. And there's nothing inherently in conflict between those two approaches. And I think it's unfortunate that most people equate Kanban with non-iterative delivery systems, as opposed to, if you're doing something iterative, make it visible, limit your work in process, and then have explicit policies and improve over time. I think that's for some reason the association of Kanban and pure flow non-iterative delivery got made at some point back in the day.
I think that's a great point, Dan. There's nothing in Scrum that says we can't deliver something within a sprint, right? Scrum, actually, the framework just says, hey, we have to, at the end of each sprint, we have to at least have something to deliver, right? We have to at least be able to potentially ship product. But if we want to do it more often than that, I would strongly encourage that as a Scrum Master. I would think that would be great because that means we've solved some problems around delivery. We're doing a lot of good, scalable, repeatable type of work in delivery, and we're probably doing some kind of flow. So that's all within the Scrum framework.
Absolutely. Let's talk about, so we talked about, in the intro, metrics. We want to talk about some of the Kanban metrics in the Scrum framework. And unfortunately, from a Scrum standpoint, and it's not even in the Scrum guide, is this concept of velocity. Ooh, check me on that. Is that true? That's true, right?
Yeah. It talks about velocity, team velocity, for sure.
I just kind of threw up in my mouth when I said we're not talking about velocity. From a Scrum Guide standpoint, I'm like, wait, but is it? Is it in there? There's so many misnomers about what's in the Scrum Guide.
Right. So velocity would be, a practice you would use, and you need to understand that because we're doing backlog refinement in Scrum. So when we talk about velocity, if we're looking at it through a Kanban lens, we're going to look at it a little differently, right? Whereas velocity is concerned with points, right? And, how much is a team delivering every sprint? A Kanban is going to be looking at throughput, which is a little different. So throughput is not concerned with the size of a product backlog item, let's say, right? So let's just take that. We're delivering at a product backlog item. So throughput's going to be measuring a specific type of item that delivers value. So in a Scrum sense, that's typically a product backlog item. And we're going to look at that product backlog item and we're going to, measure when that gets done. So we're going to use things like throughput as an example, how fast can that be delivered? And really when you look at Kanban, so I'll throw this out. I've been reading Daniel Lacandi's book about Agile metrics, which talk a lot about this, throughput, WIP, and those kinds of metrics, cycle time. And, one of the things he talks about is we are measuring for predictability. And with throughput, we're measuring getting a PBI item done. We're not worried so much about, is that an 8? Is it a 5? Whatever. We're just worried about delivering value. So what do you think about that, Dan?
I'm intrigued by it, and it seems like it would bring up the whole no estimates concept again. And yeah, predictability is super valuable. That's going to allow us to build trust with stakeholders. When you say, hey, here's our product backlog, here's what you can expect in this sprint, in the next sprint, going forward multiple sprints and trying to do some kind of forecasting. You absolutely need some measure of predictability. So many times teams set themselves up for having a single point target, which they're guaranteed to miss. I mean, it's defined to such precision that it's absolutely a wrong estimate, as opposed to something that is within a range where you have a probability of delivering on time, or within that boundary.
Absolutely.
So yeah, throughput, the number of things delivered per unit time. That's essentially the summary of what that metric's going to be.
Absolutely. And, cycle time, we can come back to that, but cycle time, throughput, and WIP are typically the things we talk about when we're just talking straight Kanban and using that as a method to achieve that value. One of the things that's really introduced in this Scrum with Kanban is this idea of work item aging. So that's another metric that we can use. And what's interesting to me about it is the idea is we can see within a sprint, hey, how long have we been working on these work items in there? And that can help the team actually adjust, right? So let's say we're looking at work items in a sprint and we're looking at how long we have been working on them. We can start, as we get more metrics, we can start to understand, hey, if we think that we can get 6 work items done, for instance, and we look at this and we can see, oh, we have 6 work items in progress, but none of them are done. And it's a 2-week sprint and we're in, the 5th day, let's say. We can have some good predictability around that. And, what do you think that would tell you, Dan? Do you have any ideas if you had that?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, the amount of aging on the work items with none delivered, the closer that gets to being your sprint duration, the less likely you are to deliver those within the sprint. And in fact, my brain kind of wandered because as you were talking about work item aging, my brain went to, well, wait, compare that to cycle time. And I think I'll say what occurred to me. So cycle time is the start of working on something, adding value to it until it's done. And so your work item aging, though, is just a running clock essentially on your work items. So they're not necessarily done, which would allow you to calculate a cycle time. It's a running clock since they were started. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I would think of work item aging as a leading indicator for your team. So another thing that's brought up within the Scrum and Kanban guide is something called a service level expectation, right? Which, if you're a Kanban person, it's not, there's something called SLAs, right? And those kinds of things. So service level expectation is in that spirit of forecasting within Scrum. So we're trying to set expectations with our stakeholders and with our product owners that we can deliver within, using percentages and those kinds of things to give that confidence level, right? So they can be very predictable. So when we're doing those kinds of things, when we come back to that work item aging, that's kind of a leading indicator that can really help a team focus. So for instance, in a daily Scrum, if we see that, we've started every work item and nothing's finished, that should tell us something, right? We're going to have some really long ages on some of these work items. And obviously, if you're a flow kind of person with Kanban, you would say, hey, that means your WIP is really high. You're not limiting your WIP probably the way you should. So don't want to get into necessarily that in this talk about limiting WIP, but obviously that's a key practice that you want in using Kanban. But on the metric side, that work item aging is going to help your team look at what they're doing and even start talking about, hey, should we be looking at those WIP limits and doing something with them so that we can get to more predictability?
Ooh, I know you don't want to go there, but I wanted to touch on WIP because when you said work item aging as a leading indicator, to me, I'd always thought of the WIP limit as being the only leading indicator. So cycle time is looking backwards, throughput is looking backwards. But the work in process, as you squeeze the number of things down that you're working on at any given time, it should improve your cycle time, should improve your throughput. So I'd always thought of that as the leading indicator. And now I think this additional concept of work item aging is also important. So the two together seem like it would be very valuable.
Oh, I agree. I think it's a concept that is going to really help Scrum teams. I mean, I'm sure you've never seen this, Dan, because you coach awesome teams. But sometimes some people I've heard have been on.
Can you hear my smile as you say that?
Right. But some people and some teams somewhere I've heard about this, they occasionally might run into a problem where we're working hard in a sprint, working very hard, and we're getting to the end of the sprint, and all of a sudden we have to test everything. And your sprint burn, you're done. If you do any kind of release burn down, you look at, everything is getting done near the end of the sprint, right? And that causes some issues, typically for these teams that we occasionally see. That, right?
Well, it's absolutely normal, especially for newer teams when they're starting out with Scrum. They still live in their silos, and they're still kind of making miniature waterfalls within a sprint. And you absolutely have kind of a build. Some of them have code freezes a couple days before the end of a 2-week sprint, if that's what they're doing, and the QA folks dive in. All kinds of fascinating behavior. That's fairly common. So, I mean, it's not that people are bad people. It's a very common behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And because, we are conditioned to think, oh, wait a minute, we aren't going to get something done. We've got all these things in process and they're not done yet. So maybe what I should do is add some more work, because somebody's sitting there not working on the coding part. So maybe they can start something so we can get things done. And obviously that's very contrary to things like Little's Law, which we won't get into, but I got to throw that in there, right? If we're talking Kanban.
So we'll just post a link to that in the show notes that people can get at agilethought.com/podcast. So there, yep, we'll link to Little's Law.
Yeah, so very important if you want to think about that and cycle time. But the idea is, like you said, it's a little contrary to what we typically think of, but the less work we do within a system, really, not work we do, but the less items we have work in process, then the more predictable and the quicker we get things done. So like an example I told you about, I think, Dan, we played a Kanban game. It's called Get Kanban, right? And when you play that game with some teams, it's really like doing software development using a Kanban system. It simulates that very well, I think. And one of the things that can happen is teams will, do some things that they shouldn't do from a Kanban standpoint. Maybe they'll increase WIP limits instead of decreasing them when they should decrease them. But one thing that happens is there is, that emergency PBI or piece of value that we have to get through, and we have a date we have to do that by. And teams typically will do that, and it will take them. They'll flow that through the system, in 2-3 days, as opposed to when most pieces take 8 days to get done, right? And what's funny about that is a good lesson of what limiting your WIP does, right? Because that's what the teams do on these high value emergency issues, is all of a sudden they're limiting their WIP. And so to kind of bring this back to the work item aging metric, once you have WIP limits in place and you have that work item aging metric, that's really going to help you be more predictable about what you're going to get done within a sprint. And really, what we're doing in a sprint from a Kanban perspective is we're working towards that sprint goal, right? That's typically what that's helping you to accomplish. So
definitely. So I want to swing back here, long S for people's ears there. But we've got the cycle time. We mentioned that, and we've got throughput, which hopefully is another enabler for effective sprint planning as your teams are trying to set their sprint goals. And then the work item aging and work in process limits. You used a phrase, and I wanted to go back and amplify it a little bit. You talked about service level expectation as opposed to what is usually the term of service level agreement, which that service level agreement, it is most often used. It feels like there's a stick behind it. If you violate the service level agreement, you don't respond in a day, deliver in a week, deliver in 2 weeks, whatever the case is, there's a stick behind a service level agreement. And I like the replacement of agreement with expectation, because then you're talking about probability and you're communicating that there is some uncertainty in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you that is something I like. And in the spirit of Scrum, really, in Scrum, as you know, we went from every sprint, we were committing to our sprint backlog. And then a few iterations of the Scrum Guide that got changed to forecast for very good reasons. So we are forecasting what we're going to get done in a sprint. And to me, that service level expectation, it fits right in with that forecasting idea and mentality, and the idea behind predicting when we're done. So, going back to Daniel Volcante's book, one of the things he talks about is, whenever we start a software project, what does everybody want to know? When are we going to get it done, right?
Absolutely.
So this helps with that. This actually helps in being predictable. And it does so with data, right? So we're taking data and Scrum, but a lot of the good practices Scrum had, things like velocity, those helped and with that. But what I'm seeing with when you introduce Kanban is we get even more predictability and we have even more metrics that will help us communicate to the customer, hey, this is what you can expect, right? So we have throughput, cycle time, those all give us some comfortable things about historically what we've been able to do. And then we as a team can say, hey, we think we can, at an 85% confidence level, we'll get this many pieces of value done in this amount of time. If you want 100%, maybe it's this number, and if you want 50%, as long as you understand we're giving you confidence levels and it's not a commitment.
Have a topic you want us to tackle? Send an email to podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast.
There was a nice visual that went along with it, but it was a conversation really about how when we build plans for projects so often, especially in waterfall, but even with Scrum teams or non-Scrum Agile teams, all kinds of teams, we actually build a plan that gives us a very low probability of hitting the targets that we're establishing. Because we don't have metrics, we're trying to, quote, be aggressive or, trying to satisfy a stakeholder or somebody in a position of power of some kind. And we build incredibly fragile, low probability plans almost by default. And I like the concepts of bringing in these metrics, bringing in the data, and it hopefully shifts from an opinion of how long a group of people think it's going to take to do stuff to driving it off the historic metrics of that team, which does point out then that these are going to work. You need a base of data for them to work. You can't throw together a new team and come up with a high probability plan.
Absolutely. That you need that basis of data. Most tools today are going to support what you need to do. Worst case scenario, I'll export everything I need into Excel and I can track it. But certainly these basic metrics in there, you can get more sophisticated with them, but these will help start that predictability, right? Of based on this data, and what we know today, we've got a pretty high probability, or maybe we don't, but the product owner wants to roll the dice. That's okay, as long as you're going in there eyes wide open.
Absolutely. One of the concepts, and this might be a fun thing, we'll see how long this goes. You talked about the commitment of the team to deliver something in the Scrum framework in older versions of the Scrum guide. And that, of course, much like service level agreements, turned into a stick to beat teams with. Teams would get encouraged to take on more work or well, can't you just do one more or two more or three more product backlog items? And then they were committed to them, air quotes, and gosh, they get in trouble, essentially, if they missed. And then it went to more of a forecast, and now we've got the sprint goal, which is what we're trying to hold sacred and really deliver on. And we had a little bit of a conversation here. I still like Scrum teams to deliver kind of what they planned. I think it builds some trust with your stakeholders that, hey, here's what we're intending to deliver, here's what you get. And it feels like work carrying over one sprint to the next can become a very slippery slope, kind of to not delivering meaningful increments every sprint. What do you think?
I agree with that. And I would say there's a problem if your team is forecasting getting things done and they're not meeting that. Typically, what I would hope would happen is we're forecasting and we need to add another PBI because we got everything done. Obviously that's what we want. And it's not done with a stick, but the team is self-organizing and saying, hey, we're at day, we've got 2 days left in a sprint. And what happens then, right? and we're done with with all of the PBIs we forecasted, what should we do? Should we take on this new PBI, which we may not get done, or should we, work on technical debt or whatever, which is just something we'll throw out, right? As Scrum trainers, that's something you could do. To me, I'm okay with that. If you maybe go over the sprint, we don't finish that PBI, as long as we met our forecast. Now, if we're not meeting our forecast and you're saying, what happens then? That might happen once in a while, but if it's a trend, then we should talk, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And what's the phrase? Was it Schwaber? I don't want to misinterpret it. Scrum's like your mother-in-law. It points out all your flaws or something to that effect.
I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah. We'll try and find a quote. We'll try and attribute that quote correctly, but I believe that's where it came from. Because the Scrum framework is incredibly simple. You've got your roles, your events, your artifacts. There's not a ton to it, but it's not easy to do. It's very difficult to deliver an increment within a sprint of between 1 and 4 weeks.
Yep.
And so then, you might start by having challenges, hitting your sprint goal, challenges, delivering on that increment, but that's your opportunity for continuous improvement. And so maybe that's a place as we kind of approach our time box here, using these metrics and this data for continuous improvement. How do you see these helping out teams in retrospectives, either the Scrum event retrospectives or just more generically retrospecting, inspecting, and adapting their process for delivery?
Well, where I see them really helping is the fact that we have these actionable metrics, right? So let's say we forecast something and we didn't make it. Now we have these metrics. We have throughput, cycle time, the WIP limit, the WIP, work in process, how did that go? And, really our Kanban board, we'll look at that, and we can look at all those things and say, what happened? Now we have a lot of solid data within our sprint to go into that retro and figure out if something went wrong. Hopefully, we should have some good indication what went wrong. If things went right, what can we continue to improve? So I think those metrics will help a retrospective be more, I almost want to say meaty in that, hey, we have more data. Typically you go in there with velocity and your forecast, but this gives you more. And that work item aging, hey, we can look what was happening day by day and, kind of analyze that and see if that gives us clues.
Yeah. And if folks are sizing their backlog items, which is a pretty common practice, you can start looking at correlations between the size of the items and the ability to deliver and, how long it takes work items to be delivered and those kinds of things, and really start to notice some patterns in there.
Absolutely. All good stuff.
Eric, you'd mentioned something earlier, and I'll paraphrase. You said, kind of like most of these tools are doing it. I feel like I'm getting the short straw on the tool standpoint because I am, it seems like perpetually going into situations where the tools don't really support collection of data. And if folks are using physical boards, and of course, that's not going to calculate the data for you. I love the physical boards too. So are there some templates out there you like to use as far as Excel, or how does one get started if they're interested in this but don't have the tooling that supports it?
Great question. There are a lot of cycle time templates. I don't really have any favorites, but for the show notes, if you'd like, I can maybe come up with some links.
You're on the spot. There's that site. Let me Google that for you. I feel like let's maybe we'll put in one or two that maybe bubbled to the top for us.
Yeah. So, typically I'm just creating them myself and doing pivot charts because that's kind of fun for me.
And that's how you roll. Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah. But I don't think they're terribly difficult. The cycle time is just an area chart in Excel, right? So with trend over time, that to me the hardest part's going to be especially if the tool's not doing it, is you have to collect that data daily, right? You just have to remember to do that.
Yeah, and that's where I've seen, if there's a data person on the team, it just gets really excited about spreadsheets and pulling things in like that. It can be very useful for doing that tracking. Yep. It doesn't have to be one person. It doesn't have to be the Scrum Master who does it. It doesn't have, anybody can do it or self-organize around that. Yep. And collect some of that data.
Absolutely.
Was there anything else on Kanban metrics and Scrum framework that you thought we should touch on before we wrap up?
There's all kinds of things, Dan, but I'll leave that maybe for another podcast.
We'll leave that for another time. So the book you were referring to by Daniel Vicanti was Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability?
That is correct, and I'm really loving that book. Love it.
Very good. Yeah, Daniel's a pretty sharp guy from what I can tell. I've had a chance to listen to him at conferences, and so that sounds like a fantastic read. Anything else you're reading or consuming these days that's got you inspired that you want to share?
Yeah, that's pretty much the one I'm reading right now. Not a lot of other books I'm reading. I'm trying to move right now, Dan, so I have a lot of other tasks on my plate.
That doesn't sound like it would take much effort.
Yeah, it's trivial, right?
Right. Well, I am excited. I'm reading a book called Lead True. It's the subtitle is Live Your Values, Build Your People, and Inspire Your Community. And it's written by a physician and hospital system CEO, Jeff Thompson. He's retired now, and I happened to sit next to him on one of my flights back from New York to home. And his leadership style and advocating for values-based leadership, especially when you have to make hard choices and you want to make sure that you have alignment in the organization around the values, really resonated with me, especially since agility and Kanban and all these things really have leadership in them. We talk a lot about servant leadership in the community. So I sat next to him. We had a chat. I got the book, and we should have him as a guest here as soon as we can work out some logistics with him. And so I'm very excited about that. We'll have Dr. Jeff Thompson. He led a $1 billion health system in the upper Midwest. And so really excited. So maybe folks will stay tuned to that, and we'll be sure to get some tweets out about that as that episode gets ready to go live in a few weeks, hopefully.
That's awesome.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for sharing on Kanban metrics and the Scrum framework, Eric. Appreciate it. And it sounds like there'll be a follow-on conversation at some point.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dan.
This has been the Agile Coaches Corner podcast, brought to you by AgileThought. Get the show notes and other helpful tips from this episode and other episodes at agilethought.com/podcast.